Good morning, Africa. Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's start with the Vanguard newspaper. On the Vanguard newspaper, making headlines at the front page, we have candidates talk tough, unveil plans for states. You can find the full story on page 8 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, on page 2 of the Vanguard newspaper, we have house scavengers wreak havoc on public facilities. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, we have passengers stranded as unions protest ground flights in Lagos and Abuja. You can find that full story on page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, we have Atiku raises concern over outdated beavers. You can find the full story on page 32 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, we have Tinubu project $50 billion revenue to unlock offshore investments. You can find the full story on page 30 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still on the Vanguard newspaper, we have ASU orders 20 varsities to prepare for strike, gives federal government and state 14 days. You can find the full story on page 9 of the Vanguard newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, we have Jonathan's 2015 sacrifices saved Nigeria's democracy, says by Nenadi Usman. You can find the full story on page 12 of the Vanguard newspaper. And lastly, for the Vanguard newspaper, we have federal government targets 6 flashpoints in new push to end farmers' herders' clashes. You can find that full story on page 7 of the Vanguard newspaper. Moving away from the Vanguard newspaper to the Daily Trust newspaper, making headlines, we have loses disruptions as labor unions ground flights. You can find that full story on page 3 and page 4 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Still at the Daily Trust newspaper, we have some stories at the upper side like Nigeria's democracy needs review, said by Obasanjo and Jonathan. You can see the full story on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Still at the upper side, one of the stories, we have Sokoto, Kaduna, Adamawa, and 10 others to experience flood in August, said by NIMET. You can find the full story on page 8 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Still on the Daily Trust newspaper, we have APC, ADC, NDC, and others upload candidates as INEC short spotter. You can find the full story on page 12 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Still on the Daily Trust newspaper, we have government to pay workers disengaged 20 years ago. You can find the full story on page 8 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Still on the Daily Trust newspaper, at the bottom, we have one of the stories here. Tinubu, Sultan asks Nigerians to unite against insecurity. You can find the full story on page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper. And lastly, for that newspaper, we have federal government to rehabilitate 417 grazing reservoirs. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Guardian newspaper, making headlines at the front page, we have chaos as passengers, airlines suffer losses from over 80 cancelled flights. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. One of the stories at the upper side of the Guardian newspaper, we have federal government recovers 3 billion naira media debts, declares end to unpaid adverts. You can find the full story on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. Still at the upper side, one of the stories here, we have ADC unveils code of ethics document for candidates and members. You can see the full story on page 3. Still on the page 3 of the Guardian newspaper, we have another story. Adeleke, Oyebamiji, Salam talks tough of victory. You can find the full story on page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, we have Obasanjo, Jonathan, and others seek overhaul of Nigeria's democracy governance structure. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Guardian newspaper. Still on the Guardian newspaper, we have one of the stories here about ASU prepares 20 varsities for industrial action, issues 14 days warning. You can find the full story on page 4 of the Guardian newspaper. Still on the Guardian newspaper, we have UBEC urges states to deploy unutilized 332 billion naira education development fund. You can find that full story on page 7 of the Guardian newspaper. And lastly, for the Guardian newspaper, we have Nigeria's high debt service draining social infrastructure spending, AFDB wants. You can find the full story on page 18 of the Guardian newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper, making headlines at the front page, we have 10 battlegrounds local governments that may decide Adeleke Oyebamiji race. You can find the full story on page 2 and page 8 of the Punch newspaper. One of the stories at the upper side of the Punch newspaper, we have Fubara, lawmakers battle stalls Rivers, 1.85 trillion naira budget. You can find the full story on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Still at the upper side of the Punch newspaper, we have one of the stories that said from Tinubu, no difference what breaking Nigeria apart. You can find the full story on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Still in that same page of the Punch newspaper, we have another story. Obasanjo, Obi demands major shake-off of democratic institution. You can find the full story on page 9 of the Punch newspaper. Still at the Punch newspaper, at the bottom side, we have one of the stories that said 10 cops, 2 civilians killed, 17 bandits neutralized in Kebbi. You can find the full story on page 4 and page 5 of the Punch newspaper. One of the stories still at the bottom side of the same newspaper, we have modular refineries shun domestic crude over high costs. You can find that story on page 20 of the Punch newspaper. Still in that same newspaper, we have 224 dead, 700 injured as powerful earthquake rocks Colombia. You can find the full story on page 12 of the Punch newspaper. Still on the Punch newspaper, we have police plan fresh security roadmap ahead of 2027 polls. You can see the full story on page 12 of the Punch newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune, making headlines at the front page, we have Adeleke demands Osun senators arrest. You can find the full story on page 3 of the newspaper. One of the stories at the upper side of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper, we have Tinubu approves deep offshore investment framework to unlock $50 billion in new investments. You can find the full story on page 23 of the Nigerian Tribune. Still at the upper side, we have 10 police officers, 17 bandits killed in Zamfara Kebbi clash. You can find the full story on page 13 of the newspaper. Still in that same newspaper, we have under health, sickle cell traits may hide diabetes. Ghana study warns. You can find the full story on page 10 of the Nigerian Tribune. Still in the same newspaper, we have Nigeria to benefit from $100 billion investment in oil, gas, and others. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Nigerian Tribune. At the bottom side, we have no democracy in Africa, but first like liberal democracy, said by Obasanjo. You can see the full story on page 22 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Still in that same newspaper, we have TUC demands 1,000 naira to dollar exchange rates. You can find the full story on page 23 of the Nigerian Tribune newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun newspaper, we have Atiku raises concern over outdated beavers and IREV. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. On the upper side, we have a story where it says Adeleke demands arrest of Father Husi over kill them call. You can find the full story on page 26 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Still in that same newspaper, we have federal government to strengthen security in vulnerable communities with man-o-war volunteers. You can find the full story on page 9 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Still at the bottom side of the Daily Sun newspaper, we have ADC unveils governance code, vows to play different politics. You can see the full story on page 27 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Still on the Daily Sun newspaper, making headlines at the front page, we have Obasanjo, Jonathan, Obi express worry over state of democracy. You can find the full story on page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. And lastly, for that newspaper, we have Sultan, APC chair, cleric warns against religious division as ADC condemns Jingi. You can find the full story on page 27 of the Daily Sun newspaper. Moving away from the Daily Sun newspaper to the First Daily newspaper, we have Singer seeks US pressure over governorship election. You can find that full story in the First Daily newspaper. One of the stories at the upper side of the same newspaper, we have Nigerian Army opens application for 50/2027 Short Service Commission. You can find the full story still on the First Daily newspaper. Still at the upper side, we have Ebola death toll hits 2011 in DR Congo as outbreak surges. You can find that full story on the First Daily newspaper. Still at the First Daily newspaper, we have Nigeria plans to end crude exports as local refineries expand. Also, another story here, we have injustice, inequity undermining Nigeria's democracy, said by Diri. You can find the full story in the First Daily newspaper. And lastly, for that newspaper, we have NUPROC warns job seekers over fake recruitment letters. You can find that full story in the First Daily newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the last newspaper for our newspaper review today, we have the Matrix newspaper. Making headlines at the front page, we have Tinubu unveils $50 billion deep offshore investment framework. You can find that full story on page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. On the same Matrix newspaper at the bottom side, we have Funke Akindele debunks death rumors about the 4 director. You can find the full story on page 23 of the Matrix newspaper. Still at the same newspaper at the bottom side, we have CBN opens sandbox to stablecoin virtual assets operators program. You can find the full story on page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. Still at the same newspaper, we have Trump backs Infantino, warns FIFA against sacking presidents. You can find that full story on page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Still at the same Matrix newspaper, we have Q Accord members' comments. Obi, Atiku's aide demands Senator Fadahunsi's arrest and prosecution. You can find the full story on page 2 of the Matrix newspaper. Still on the Matrix newspaper, we have Adeleke, Oyinyola trade tackles ahead of polls. You can find the full story on page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. And lastly, for the Matrix newspaper, we have First Bank, Fidelity lead in volume, value as NPS processes over 26 million transactions. You can find a full story on page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. And we've come to the end of the newspaper review for today. Please stay tuned with us. Thank you.